Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Winston Peters announced this week that New Zealand is suspending its extradition treaty with Hong Kong. It's doing this in light of China's new national security law, which allows it to prosecute and imprison Hong Kong residents who stage political protests. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
The Chinese ambassador has responded to New Zealand by warning it to stay out of China's internal affairs. When has our relationship with China been at such a low level in the past?
Well, that's quite a good question, because I think our relationship with China has been very positive for the best part of 4 or 5 decades. We established diplomatic relations with China in 1972. We were one of the first developed countries to do so. A number of other Western countries followed. And the relationship has been blossoming for much of the period since. In 2001, we supported China's admission to the World Trade Organization. 2008, we were the first Western country to sign a free trade deal with China. I suppose the relations between the two countries have become strained in the last few years, and possibly the second low point after the current one would be Huawei last year, when the GCSB indicated that they believed there were problems with including China in a Chinese company, Huawei, in the 5G infrastructure development project.
Is New Zealand simply following the lead of its Five Eyes alliance partners in suspending this extradition treaty?
No, I don't think so. We, unlike the rest of the Five Eyes, didn't immediately. They suspended their extradition treaty with Hong Kong earlier. We made the decision in mid-July to review it, and we've now reached the decision that we would, if you like, comply with the rest of the Five Eyes. But I think we have our own independent foreign policy decisions for doing that. New Zealand is a pluralist democracy, and from a New Zealand point of view, there's little doubt that China has, from a New Zealand perspective, acted in breach of its obligations of this agreement, which was called the One Country, Two Systems approach, whereby certain democratic freedoms were enshrined in Hong Kong until the official handover of full sovereignty to China in 2047. China disagrees and believes that since Hong Kong is reverting to Chinese control, then it's entitled to take these measures. There's one thing I would say, while I think New Zealand has made a decision which is consistent with its independent foreign policy, I think it's been slightly blurred. Seen through Chinese eyes, Mr. Peters, for example, spoke about the importance of rule of law and democracy. But China will be watching the election here, and it's no secret that Mr. Peters has enlisted the help of key Brexiteers from the UK, Aaron Banks and Andy Wigmore. Their organisation, Leave EU, was involved in multiple breaches of electoral law. And also, they're big Trump supporters. So, in a sense, while I think New Zealand government's decision is absolutely justified, I think it's unfortunate, and maybe it's a dynamic of coalition politics, that decision has been slightly blurred by the official rationales given that China's breached the rule of law, when in fact the foreign minister has sought the assistance of those who have undermined the rule of law in the UK.
Good point. Who are China's friends now?
Well, I think a lot of countries which have what I call business-like relations with China. Its closest ally is North Korea. China is North Korea's major trading partner, and it is formally allied to North Korea. It has also, again for strategic relations, friendly relations with Pakistan, and it also has a strategic, I think, partnership with Russia. But I think that's a marriage of convenience, really. The Russians and the Chinese they both have authoritarian systems. I don't think it's a marriage of principle, a marriage of convenience, really. And I think that there is a fair degree of suspicion between Russia and China. China's relationship with Japan has warmed up recently, And China has also cultivated a number of friends in the Pacific, the Pacific Islands states, which of course where New Zealand has a big interest in the South Pacific. But I would say that China has only a few close friends or allies, and mainly business-like relations with the rest of the world.
Has the COVID-19 pandemic strengthened or weakened China as an economic world power?
That's a difficult question to answer in the short term. I think the Chinese economy has bounced back impressively between April of this year and June of this year, the second quarter. It's back into growth again. In the first quarter, with COVID-19 in full cry, so to speak, in China, the economy slumped alarmingly. There was a 6.8% drop in growth during that period, during that quarter. So the Chinese economy's come back. I think, however, the Chinese economy, there's been some political, I think COVID has damaged the international reputation of China. For one thing, it highlighted that with a one-party state is not as transparent as it should be. It took some while before China transmitted the information to the World Health Organization about the nature of COVID-19. In fact, we know now that the first signs of COVID-19 were detected in Wuhan in late November, but that information only got through in late December, early January to the World Health Organization. Once China made the commitment to come clean, then it did so quite impressively. But many people would worry, and there was quite a lot of anger in China, and still is anger in China, about how the government handled it. So I don't think China comes out of COVID-19 with an enhanced global reputation.
Is China strong enough or important enough economically that it can do whatever it wants to politically?
If we had Xi Jinping here, he might say yes, but I think that's a really interesting issue, because I think China may believe, since it is been, if you like, since it's had enhanced economic and military power in the last decade, it's entitled to all the global perks that go with that. What we've certainly seen under Xi Jinping is in the last 10 years, China's become more assertive and more China-centric, more nationalistic, and has become more belligerent around issues like Taiwan and Hong Kong. Whether that will work for China is another matter. It's one thing for a state to strike a certain posture. Whether it's acceptable to the rest of the world when that world is interconnected is another matter. So my answer is no. I think China will have to adjust its foreign policy. I think it's trying to have its cake and eat it. It's trying to project, it's got a one-party state, and it's trying to project some of those values to the rest of the world. They will not be acceptable. And I think there will also be tensions within the Communist Party of China, because we often assume that China's is sort of monolithic whole because it's got one party in charge. But there will be quite heated discussions behind closed doors in the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. And there's a crucial issue here, Bruce. China's rise to superpower status has depended on its full-blooded involvement in the world capitalist system. And it's crucially dependent on markets such as the EU, the United States and Japan. So while it may have fights with one or two key players like the United States and Japan at different times, it certainly won't want confrontation on all fronts. So what I'm saying is I think the response from China will be in the short term robust, but in the longer term I think we can expect them not to do anything which would interrupt their economic success, which in turn could be a challenge to the legitimacy of the ruling Communist Party.
So do you expect the relationship between New Zealand and China to revive or worsen?
I think it could be strained in the short term. And and I think what was striking about the Huawei confrontation, if that's not too strong a term to put it was certainly strained relations after Huawei, was that Jacinda Ardern made a flying one-day visit to Beijing, and because there was the interruption of the Christchurch atrocity, which meant that they couldn't have their scheduled several days meeting. So there was just a one-day visit. But that seemed to diffuse things. Face-to-face contact is important for the Chinese leadership. And to the surprise of many, China was prepared to start upgrading the free trade agreement. New Zealand had been pushing for this for some time, and that the negotiations began on that process following Jacinda Ardern's visit. I think both sides value the relationship. China values New Zealand as a developed country which has good relations with the United States but is not seen as a lackey. And I think China always makes a distinction between Australia and New Zealand in that context. At the same time, we are a pluralist democracy, and we cannot suspend our values and interests for the sake of economically fruitful relations with China. That would be a sort of master-servant relationship with us playing the role of servant. That wouldn't be acceptable here. We're a democracy. The other thing is that I think the message that New Zealand decision makers may take from this episode is that we must accelerate our efforts to diversify our trade links in the Asia Pacific. China is not the only thriving economy in the Asia Pacific. There are a number of other important players there, including Vietnam, for example, and Japan. Japan is one of the largest economies in the world. So China's not the only show in town. To answer your question, I think the relations will stabilise, but it could be in for a rocky couple of years.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.